Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're sort of digging into a figure who's been, well, consistently, one of the funniest people in British comedy for, the last couple of decades? Robert Webb.
Absolutely. And for so many people, he's just instantly jazz, isn't he? Jeremy Osborne from Peep Show, that perpetually chaotic, always optimistic, but yet deeply delusional flatmate.
Exactly. Jez, but that iconic performance, which, we'll definitely get into, it's really just scratching the surface, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Our sources, they map out this really fascinating, sometimes kind of contradictory journey. We're looking at him going from this young guy who, believe it or not, consciously tried to ditch his working class accent
Right.
to becoming vice president of the Cambridge Footlights,
Right.
which is, a big deal.
Yeah.
Then a BAFTA-winning performer. And then more recently, this shift into being a really acclaimed memoirist and a very public voice on some pretty serious stuff.
Like masculinity, addiction, health.
Exactly.
All.
That.
And that's really our mission today, isn't it? To try and trace that evolution. We've pulled together quite a bit of detail on his early life, which was complex. The start of that huge partnership with David Mitchell.
Landmark. Right?
Yeah, landmark. Some moments where his career hit, controversy. And then his solo writing, which is surprisingly serious. And these massive health challenges he's faced.
Fundamentally, though, the starting point is English comedian, actor, writer, known best as half of Mitchell and Webb. And Jez Osborne in Peep Show is what really cemented him in the public consciousness.
And Peep Show, it's worth remembering, ran for 9 series. 9.
Right.
That made it Channel 4's longest-running sitcom ever.
Which is incredible longevity. But the real deep dive, I think, starts when we look at how maybe the vulnerabilities, the traumas of the guy behind Jez, how they eventually became the raw material for his later, more personal work.
Okay, so let's unpack that from the start. You hear Robert Webb speak now. And it's that very neutral, almost RP, sort of placeless English accent. But his roots are somewhere very specific, aren't they? And his early life, well, it was pretty turbulent.
Yeah, his roots are very much East Midlands. Robert Patrick Webb, born in Boston, Lincolnshire. That was September 29, 1972. And he grew up in Woodhall Spa, specifically on a council estate.
Which, like you said, immediately kind of cuts against the grain of that typical Oxbridge comedy background.
Totally. He went to Queen Elizabeth's Grammar School in Horncastle. So this upbringing, miles away from the London comedy scene, it really does set the scene for the things he writes about later class, identity, all that stuff in his memoir.
And it wasn't just about where he grew up. The story of those early years involves some really profound loss and, change.
It really does. His parents divorced when he was only 5. Then his mother remarried about a year later, so there's already instability there. But the really huge life-changing event happened when he was 17.
Right when he was prepping for A-levels.
Yeah. Exactly. Lower sixth form, getting ready for those crucial exams.
And his mother tragically died from breast cancer. I mean, that just completely throws everything off course.
Must have been devastating.
Yeah. And it meant he had to move in with his father, who, by his own account, he had pretty difficult relationship with. And then he actually had to resit his A-levels because of the disruption.
That kind of grief and upheaval at that age especially, it must shape everything. And the sources mention this incredible detail about how that trauma, or maybe the feelings around it, led to this really conscious decision about his identity.
This is such a fascinating nugget, yeah. The sources are specific. At age 13, partly because he felt this resentment towards his father, he made a deliberate, conscious choice to lose his local Lincolnshire accent.
Wow.
And the result is the neutral accent we hear now. It really suggests someone who was already, even as a teenager, incredibly aware of how he came across and maybe willing to, literally change how he sounded to escape something, a place, a past, maybe pain he associated with it all. So he gets through that incredibly tough time, resits his exams, and then manages to get into Cambridge.
He does. In 1992, he goes up to Robinson College, Cambridge, to read English. And, as often happens, talent finds its way. He gets drawn into the university's, legendary drama scene. And crucially, he becomes a member of the Footlights.
Maybe we should just quickly explain Footlights for anyone listening who isn't, steeped in UK comedy history. It's significance.
Yeah, good point. Footlights is basically Cambridge University's amateur theater club, but calling it that almost undersells it. It's arguably the most famous, most influential comedy nursery in the world.
The alumni list is just ridiculous.
It's insane. Peter Cook, all the Pythons, Stephen Fry, Hugh Laurie, Emma Thompson, Sacha Baron Cohen. I mean, it goes on and on. So if you become the vice president, which Webb did, you're essentially involved in shaping the next wave of British comedy. And it was there, in that environment, that he met the person who would define so much of his career.
The famous meeting, David Mitchell. How did that actually happen?
It was pure footlights. Happened in 1993. They were both at an audition for a Footlights production of the pantomime Cinderella.
Cinderella, right?
Yeah. And apparently, they clicked pretty quickly, realized they had this chemistry, not just personally, but comedically. And they started working together almost right away.
I always find it interesting what these huge partnerships start with. Was their first project together like a sign of the genius to come?
Huh. No, definitely not. Which is actually quite reassuring, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone starts somewhere. Their first proper collaboration, they put it on in January 95, had this amazing title, Innocent Millions, Dead or Dying, Awry. Look at the post-apocalyptic age with songs.
Rofs.
Webb himself, looking back, didn't mince his words. He just called it Fing Terrible.
Right.
So, ambitious title, maybe not the best execution, but, it was probably a necessary failure. Helped them figure out what actually worked for them.
So from a Fing terrible start, they somehow evolve into one of the most, enduring and successful comedy partnerships we've seen. What happened after Cambridge? Did they just walk into their own TV show?
Oh, God, no. Far from it. They really had to, put the work in as writers first. They spent time writing sketches, bits of material for acts who were already established. Alexander Armstrong and Ben Miller, notably.
Right, the Armstrong and Miller show was big then.
Yeah. And they wrote for Series 2 of Big Train, which was that brilliant, slightly surreal sketch show. They did little acting bits, writing jobs on things like The Jack Daugherty Show, Comedy Nation. It was really their apprenticeship, learning the craft of writing professional TV comedy, how to structure a sketch, how to pitch ideas.
When did they actually get to be in something regularly as performers?
Well, the first kind of step into visibility on TV, where they were also the main writers, was in 2000, a BBC sketch show called Bruiser. It didn't last very long, Bruiser, but it was their first proper shot. And that led, a year later, 2001, to the Mitchell and Webb situation. That was a 6-part sketch show, but it was on Play UK, which was one of those channels that doesn't exist anymore.
Right, or Play UK, sort of.
Yeah. So these early shows, they were crucial for them to kind of test out and refine that very specific style they have, that observational, slightly awkward, cringy comedy that became their thing.
And all this was building towards the big one, the show that really defines them.
Without a doubt. The absolute cornerstone of their career, the show that launched, probably millions of memes, is Peep Show. Started in 2003, ran all the way to 2015. Webb as Jeremy Jez Osborne.
The aspiring musician, totally feckless.
Yeah, the eternal slacker flatmate. Opposite David Mitchell's Mark Corgan is just this bundle of anxiety and neurosis.
What was it about Peep Show that made it feel so different? It wasn't just another sitcom about flatmates.
No, the format was the key thing, that innovation. It was nearly all shot from the character's point of view. So you, the viewer, were literally seeing the world through Mark's eyes or Jez's eyes.
Hearing their thoughts.
And crucially, yes, hearing their inner monologues.
Yeah.
So what they actually said was often completely at odds with the terrible or anxious or ridiculous things they were thinking. And Webb's Jez, his inner thoughts were usually so self-serving and, frankly, idiotic. It was the perfect foil to Mitchell's Mark, who was just constantly beating himself up inside his own head.
It's a format that must demand a huge amount from the actors, that constant interior-exterior performance. Did the industry recognize how good they were in it?
They did.
Yeah.
I mean, Peep Show, it wasn't always a massive ratings hit, bizarrely, but critics loved it. Mitchell and Webb, they shared the Royal Television Society Award for Comedy Performance back in 2007.
Right.
And while, they were often praised as a duo, Webb did get his own solo nomination for Best Television Comedy Actor in 2009. So there was definite recognition for his specific portrayal of Jez, that mix of, chaos, but also a weird kind of vulnerability.
And beyond the sitcom, they also became huge in sketch comedy, moving from radio to TV.
Yeah, that was a really smooth, successful transition. They had the hit radio show first, that Mitchell and Webb sound. It did 5 series on BBC Radio 4, won a Sony Silver Award, very well respected.
Solid credentials.
Totally. And that success basically paved the way for the TV adaptation, which became that Mitchell and Webb look. Apparently, the producer, Gareth Edwards, said the pitch for the TV version was like the shortest pitch he'd ever written.
Yeah.
They basically just said, let's do the radio show on telly.
Lass is the Mistral, because the material was already there and proven.
Exactly. And that Mitchell and Webb look, it was a big deal in its own right. It won them the BAFTA for Best Comedy Program or Series in 2007. Got another nomination in 2009.
So by this point, they really were the defining comedy duo of that era, weren't they? That sort of slightly anxious, observational, millennial-ish voice.
Absolutely. They'd cracked the sitcom, the radio sketch show, the TV sketch show. They were everywhere and critically acclaimed pretty much across the board.
Did they try translating that success into other formats together, like film?
Yeah, they gave film a go with Magicians in 2007. Webb played Carl, one half of this rival magic act. It was, okay, not a huge hit.
Right.
They also did a short-lived series called Ambassadors in 2013. And then more recently, they reunited for Back, which ran from 2017 to 2021. That was more of a comedy drama, actually, critically well received. Explored some darker themes maybe than Peep Show.
And there's that interesting story about a pilot they actually decided not to pursue, even though the channel wanted it. Shows a bit of integrity.
Yeah, it's a great little anecdote about, I suppose, artistic control or maybe self-awareness. They filmed this pilot for BBC Two called Playing Shop. The concept was them running some kind of business out of a shed.
Okay.
And apparently the BBC really liked it. They were happy to go to series. But Mitchell and Webb themselves pulled the plug. Their reason was they felt the dynamic, the setting, the whole vibe was just too similar to Peep Show. They didn't want to just repeat themselves or, dilute their biggest hit by doing something that felt like a pale imitation. Which I think shows they were thinking long-term about their creative output.
That idea of not wanting to repeat themselves or maybe wanting to branch out leads us kind of naturally into this next phase where they made a choice that, well, for a lot of their fans and critics too, felt like a step in a very different direction. A controversial one, the Apple ads.
Ah, yes. The UK Get a Mac campaign. This was, pretty big moment in terms of commentary around them. For anyone who doesn't remember, this was Apple's big ad campaign. David Mitchell played the PC, nerdy, awkward, prone to problems.
Some Smurmer Corrigan-esque.
Totally. And Robert Webb played the Mac cool, sleek, confident, unflappable. And for a duo whose comedy often poked fun at corporate culture, at pretension, at exactly that kind of smugness, well, doing these ads felt like a clash.
And the backlash was pretty immediate and quite vicious, wasn't it? What was the core of the criticism?
It really boiled down to selling out. That was the phrase everyone used. Charlie Brooker, never one to hold back, wrote this piece in The Guardian basically saying the casting completely backfired on Apple.
How so?
Because Webb was so strongly associated with Ches, who, let's be honest, was often a smug preening tosser, to use Brooker's words. It made the Mac character seem like that, too. It made Apple look smug, not cool. The British sitcom guide went even further, didn't they? They accused them flat out of selling their souls.
Wow. Heavy stuff. How did Webb and Mitchell actually defend themselves against that kind of attack?
Well, Webb's defense was incredibly, almost brutally pragmatic. There's a specific quote where he basically cuts through all the artistic hand-wringing and just talks money. He said, look, when someone offers you the pay equivalent of an entire series of Peep Show for just a few days' work,
right,
the answer is pretty much always going to be, yeah, that's fine. It was just a professional calculation for him.
Which does put it in perspective. Peep Show was loved, but maybe it wasn't making them millionaires overnight at that point.
Exactly. And Mitchell added to that defense, didn't he? He sort of argued, look, it's just an ad. We're not doing anything morally wrong here. His line was something like, it's not like we're helping to flog a baby-killing machine.
Right.
So they saw it as a job, a very well-paid acting job. But yeah, the perception from a chunk of their fan base was definitely one of disappointment, that their anti-establishment heroes had kind of joined the establishment.
Away from the double act, though, Webb has actually built up quite a varied solo career, showing he could do more than just be Jez. What are some of the standout roles he took on without Mitchell?
Yeah, he's done quite a bit. He was in that sitcom The Smoking Room for a while, played Robin in 17 episodes between 2004 and 2005. Quite a different vibe.
Yeah.
And importantly, he took on a more sort of buttoned-up academic role in Fresh Meat, the Channel 4 uni-comedy.
Oh, yeah, he played Dan the geology lecturer.
That's the one. 2011. Showed a different side. Less manic than Jess. He also starred in that slightly bizarre Dickensian spoof comedy, The Bleak Old Shop of Stuff, played Jedrington's Secret Past. That was 2011-2012. And that's actually where he met his wife, Abigail Burtis.
Ah, okay. And he also became a real regular on the panel show circuit, didn't he? Which needs a different kind of quick wit.
Absolutely. He became almost ubiquitous for a while. You'd see him all the time on QI. He's really good on that. He's hosted, Have I Got News For You? Hosted Never Mind the Buzzcocks. It showed his confidence, his ability to think on his feet, handle unscripted comedy, cemented him as a sort of, recognizable public comedy intellectual, I suppose.
And we can't forget the dancing.
Definitely not. His win on Let's Dance for Comic Relief in 2009, that parody of the Flashdance audition scene,
Mm-hmm.
it was genuinely brilliant physical comedy. Unexpected, maybe, but hilarious.
He did some presenting and narrating, too.
Yeah, a bit. Hosted an online news thing for Channel 4 called Robert Webb back in 2010. And he narrated that series 10 Things I Hate About in 2012, which was all about puncturing nostalgia. Again, fitting that slightly cynical, observant voice he has.
But I think if we're looking for the anecdote that really sums up maybe his commitment to a role, or perhaps a certain naivety back then, we have to talk about the film Confetti.
Oh, God, yes. This is an all-timer.
Yeah.
So 2006, the film Confetti. Webb plays a naturist alongside Olivia Colman. There are a couple competing in this competition for the most original wedding.
Right, and he agreed to play a naturist.
Under one very specific, very important assumption, he was apparently absolutely convinced, assured even, that any shots showing his genitals would be blurred out, pixelated in the final film. Standard practice often.
Okay, I sense where this is going.
Yep. The moment of horror came at the actual screening of the finished film. He sat down, watched it, and realized, nope, no pixelation, nothing blurred. He was, well, fully naked on screen for everyone to see. He'd inadvertently given a very revealing performance. Speaks volumes about the unpredictable nature of filmmaking, I suppose.
Okay, so we've followed him through the comedy heights, the advertising controversy, the panel show ubiquity, but maybe the biggest shift in how we see Robert Webb, his public identity, starts when he moves beyond just writing jokes and starts writing about himself.
Yeah, this is where he really transitions from primarily a performer to also being a writer, a memoirist. I mean, the writing career technically started with Mitchell, didn't it? They put out this Mitchell and Webb book in 2009.
Right, and that shorter version, How to Cope with Mitchell and Webb.
Exactly. They were popular enough that they got signed for a 2-book deal. Although, interestingly, the sources say that second book never actually materialized, at least as of 2013.
And before the memoir, he also dipped his toe into writing commentary, didn't he, for The Telegraph?
He did, yeah. Between 2009 and 2011, he wrote opinion columns for The Telegraph's comment section. And what he said about that experience later is really quite telling, especially given what we know now about his health.
What did he say?
He admitted finding it incredibly stressful, said it would take him like a day and a half to do a piece that should have taken maybe 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And he added this really candid detail that he was often getting drunk while trying to write them to cope with the pressure or the difficulty.
Wow. That link between stress, performing in public, and drinking, that really resonates with his later story.
It absolutely does. It feels like a thread. And maybe that struggle, that vulnerability paved the way for his first really big solo project, the book that kind of redefined him for a lot of people. The memoir, How Not to Be a Boy, in 2017.
That book made a real splash, didn't it?
Huge splash. It focused right in on his childhood in Lincolnshire, growing up working class, the huge impact of his mother dying so young, and his whole struggle with, what it means to be a man, the pressures of masculinity. It clearly struck a chord. It was BBC Radio 4's Book of the Week. Got loads of attention.
What was the sort of central message he was trying to get across about boyhood or masculinity?
The main argument really was about the harm caused by those traditional expectations placed on boys and men. The whole stiff upper lip thing, hide your feelings, don't be vulnerable. Webb basically argued that's incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
And he used his own life story, the grief, the confusion after his mom died, as Exhibit A for why that needs to change.
And while he was exploring all that, dismantling those norms, he also shared something very personal that hadn't been public knowledge before.
Yeah, that was another significant part of the book's impact. It was in How Not to Be a Boy that he publicly revealed he is bisexual.
Which felt very much in keeping with the book's themes.
Exactly. It fit perfectly with that core message about authenticity, about rejecting these narrow, rigid boxes that society or maybe toxic masculinity tries to put men into. It was him practicing what he preached, using his own vulnerability to make a bigger point about acceptance and honesty.
And after the memoir was such a success, he then turned to fiction writing.
He did. Published his first novel, Come Again, in 2020 with Canongate.
Yeah.
A totally different challenge, obviously, moving into crafting fictional narratives rather than drawing directly on his own life.
Let's touch on one other reflection from around this time, his changing views on religion or belief after his mother's death.
Yeah, this is a really interesting and quite poignant insight into how grief can shake your foundations. Webb said that before his mom died, he was very much a swaggering atheist, completely non-believing.
Right.
But in an immediate, raw aftermath of losing her, he actually found himself starting to pray. He talked about it not as a genuine conversion, though, more like a a desperate coping mechanism, something, anything to try and handle that overwhelming grief.
But it didn't stick.
No. He said eventually he did return to total non-belief. But he framed it as happening only after he'd learned how to sort of coexist with her death, how to integrate that loss into his life, rather than trying to, I suppose, bargain with it through prayer. It's a really nuanced take on belief and bereavement.
That openness he found in his writing, it feels like it became crucial context when his private life took this incredibly dramatic, serious turn with a medical emergency. Before we get to that, though, just briefly, his family life.
Yeah, he married Abigail Burgess, who's also a comedian and writer, back in 2006. We mentioned they met working on The Bleak Old Shop of Stuff.
Yep.
And fittingly, David Mitchell was his best man.
Of course he was.
They live in West Hampstead, London, and they have 2 daughters. So seems like a pretty stable, settled personal life, which is quite the contrast to Jez Osborne.
Definitely. Okay, so now, the health crisis in 2020. This sounded absolutely terrifying.
It really did. It was an emergency situation. He needed urgent heart surgery for a condition called mitral valve prolapse, which basically, for anyone listening, is a serious issue where one of the heart's main valves, the one between the top and bottom left chambers, doesn't close properly. So blood leaks backward. Exactly. Puts immense strain on the heart. If you don't treat it, it can be fatal.
And the really, really shocking part of the story, reading the sources, is how he'd been explaining away the symptoms himself.
This is where it all connects back to the memoir, the drinking, the stiff upper lip maybe. Webb had been having serious symptoms, apparently things like shortness of breath, extreme fatigue. But because of his lifestyle at the time, the heavy drinking he later admitted to, he just dismissed them.
He thought it was just the booze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He actually said something like, I just assumed that's the booze. I thought this is what you feel like when you're 47 and you treat your body like a skip. It's a really painful quote.
God, so he basically thought he felt awful because he deserved to feel awful because of how he was living, not because he had a life-threatening heart defect.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which makes the eventual diagnosis this massive, sudden wake-up call.
Yeah.
It forced him to confront everything, his health, his drinking, maybe that tendency to ignore warning signs. And the immediate consequence of the surgery, which was successful, thankfully, was that he stopped drinking completely.
Right. He became sober.
Totally sober. He called his drinking towards the end certainly an addiction, a dependency. Said he realized the habit had crawled up so gradually that I was slow killing myself. The health scare, in a way, became the ultimate terrifying proof of what he'd written about ignoring your body, ignoring your feelings. It's dangerous.
And this ongoing recovery process then had a direct impact on his appearance on a certain very glittery TV show.
Chuckles. Yes, his heart condition unfortunately cut short his time on Strictly Come Dancing in 2021. He was partnered with Diane Buswell, but he had to withdraw after just 3 weeks, 3 dances.
Why specifically?
He explained that he'd started having some worrying symptoms again, related to the heart condition. And his heart specialist basically gave him very strong advice to pull out. Webb himself said quite candidly that he'd bitten off way more than I could chew for this stage in my recovery, prioritizing his long-term health over the show.
Sensible decision. Okay, the final area we need to touch on is his engagement with some quite heated political and cultural debates. He seems to have approached these with a similar kind of candor as his memoir, which, maybe predictably, landed him in hot water sometimes. We need to look at this neutrally, of course, starting with his politics.
Yes, absolutely. Just reporting what the sources say, he definitely has a history with the Labour Party. For a long time, he was a very vocal supporter. He actually joined the party in 2013, and he said it was specifically in protest against that Russell Brand interview where Brand suggested people shouldn't bother voting. Webb felt strongly about civic duty.
But he didn't stick with Labour.
No. His relationship with the party leadership soured quite significantly. By November 2015, he publicly announced he was leaving Labour. He cited a complete lack of confidence in Jeremy Corbyn's leadership at the time.
He used some pretty strong words, didn't he?
He did. He specifically mentioned Seamus Milne being appointed as Corbyn's press secretary, saying that paying his Labour subscription while Mill was in that post made him feel sick. So, clearly very strong feelings. Although it's worth noting, despite leaving and expressing that opposition, he did then endorse Labour again in the 2017 general election. So a slightly complex picture there.
Okay. And then finally, the area that's probably generated the most persistent controversy and criticism, his comments on gender identity issues.
Right. So back in 2018, Robert Webb publicly gave his support to a newspaper article that was critical of Mermaids, which is a well-known UK charity that supports transgender children and their families.
And he defined his own position.
Yes. Subsequently, he identified himself as being gender critical or a gender critical feminist. But he also insisted, at the same time, that he opposes transphobia. The position tends to involve concerns around things like self-identification versus biological sex, the implications for women-only spaces, and approaches to gender dysphoria in children.
And that stance put him right into a very polarized, very intense cultural debate.
Absolutely, a very fiery debate. The sources note he stood by those initial comments and interviews he gave in 2020. However, it's also noted that when he was asked about it again, specifically about his criticisms of mermaids, during an NPR interview in 2021, he sort of declined to get back into the specifics.
Why was that?
He apparently said he couldn't quite remember the exact details of the original article he'd supported, and also felt that the whole debate had just become incredibly overheated in the intervening years.
And we should acknowledge the reaction his stance provoked.
Yes. It's important, just factually reporting, to state that our sources confirm he received significant criticism for this position from various LGBT news outlets, from some charities, and from activists within the trans community and beyond. It really highlights how a public figure, even one known primarily for comedy, can become a focal point in these complex cultural arguments, regardless of the nuance they might intend. We're just outlining the stance and the reaction, not taking a side.
It really is an extraordinary picture, isn't it? Quite contradictory in places. The man who gave us Jez Osborne, this icon of hilarious fecklessness, is also this incredibly reflective writer who's stared down, well, near fatal illness and waded into some really thorny public debates.
I think the big takeaway really is just how much Robert Webb has evolved in the public eye. That comedy partnership with Mitchell, it was the bedrock, obviously. But his later solo work, it's just defined by this increasing vulnerability, this openness.
Yeah.
He's used his platform, his fame, to talk about things that are deeply personal and often difficult. His bisexuality, the impact of losing his mom so young, that terrifying heart scare at his battle with addiction. And not just, as therapy for himself, but seemingly to genuinely contribute to wider conversations, particularly around masculinity and emotional honesty.
He really does seem to embody that desire to dismantle the stiff upper lip he wrote about in How Not to Be a Boy. It's like the comedy's success gave him the permission or the platform to write seriously about how tough it can be to navigate modern manhood, and then the health crisis just underlined that message with this incredible life-or-death force.
Yeah, it's a fascinating example of how celebrity can transition into something more like public intellectual contribution, maybe. The comedy gets people listening, but it's the honesty, the vulnerability that gives his voice weight on these other issues.
So wrapping this up, what's the final thought for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive? We're left with this kind of split screen, aren't we? On one side, Jez chaotic, commitment-averse, kind of stuck in permanent adolescence. On the other, the Robert Webb of recent years, reflective, sober, advocating for self-care and emotional truth.
And the final question, the provocation perhaps, is about that very relationship between the performance and the person. How closely linked are those comedic portrayals of emotional failure? Jez, the ultimate man-child living in denial. How linked are they to Webb's own very public journey away from emotional repression?
Does the best comedy come from the deepest pain?
Maybe. Or maybe it's about transformation. And thinking more broadly, how does sharing personal trauma publicly, like the health scare or the early loss of his mother, how does that not just shape, but maybe even strengthen a public figure's cultural contribution? Does it shift someone from just being an entertainer to being seen as having something important to say about how we live?
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the, well, incredibly compelling life and career of Robert Webb.
Been a pleasure.